As we start, I've realised that this is a very big PowerPoint and it's behaving quite sluggishly, so I apologise if it's a bit slow on occasion, and it's going to be a bit of a problem because there's a lot to get through. Anyway, we'll see how we go. Just to start off with, a bit of an introduction. Queensland boasted a very wide range of railway operations, probably the greatest variety of types in Australia. Almost every type of tramway seen interstate was represented in Queensland, with the possible exception of logging railways using spar rails, a Tasmanian specialty. In Queensland, the railways used by industry have ranged from 18 inches gauge to the standard gauge with 4 foot 8.5, that is, with 2 foot and 3 foot 6 gauge being the most common. There were, of course, many examples of industrial railways that did not use locomotives and relied on animal or human power or powered incline haulages. This presentation does not give them much attention. I have not included heritage and museum railways, but I've given a little bit of attention to amusement and tourist railways, the operations of railway construction and demolition contractors, and that unusual and widespread feature of Queensland, rail ambulances, that ran on both the government system and on some private railways. The first industrial steam locomotives in Queensland arrived here hot on the heels of the first government railway locomotives, which was in 1865. Steam traction on private and industrial railways came into its own in the 1880s. The last steam locomotives for industrial use were supplied in the 1950s, and the last ones remained in use until 1980. Overhead wire electric locomotives were in use from just before the turn of the century and were used until recent times underground at Mount Isa. Battery electric locomotives were widely used in underground mining and tunnelling, and the earliest example I can find in Queensland was in 1930. The internal combustion locomotive was in use in Queensland by 1903, very early by world standards. Early such locomotives had either crude oil engines or petrol engines based on automobile practice. The first diesel locomotives came to Queensland in 1935. Many locomotives were imported from overseas manufacturers, and of course there were also second-hand ex-Queensland Railways locomotives used in some locations. However, innovative operators also developed home-built machines, particularly in the early days of internal combustion. The presentation reflects a work in progress to research and write a handbook of Queensland private and industrial railways. I'm looking for someone who might be able to help with preparing maps and someone who can assist me by demanding prompt completion of the project. Shire tramways. Loosely included here, these were government railways, although local government. They were essentially developmental lines with passenger and freight services constructed as a result of local initiative where the state government was not rushing to provide a railway. Some of the 3 foot 6 gauge lines became part of Queensland Railways, most notably as part of the development of the North Coast Railway to Cairns. They were financed by the local government with the debt repaid by ratepayers, sometimes long after the lines themselves were closed. There were 17 such lines in Queensland, but only 9 had their own steam locomotives. Apart from the developmental lines of the coast and hinterland, there was also the Aramac Shire Tramway in Western Queensland and the Belmont Shire Tramway in an area of what was then outer suburban Brisbane. So a few of these illustrated, and we'll go through them fairly quickly. The Mulgrave Tramway was up running south from Cairns. And I'm hitting the slowness of the presentation, unfortunately, so we'll just have to go with that. So this we used ex-Queensland Government Railway stock, as you can see, with a few purpose-built tram cars. It later became part of the North Coast line between Brisbane and Cairns. Even today, the alignment of the line south of Cairns put severe speed restrictions on what is possible. Apologies, I'm still waiting for it to click over.
A B15 or something much older?
I think it's the B13 probably, but I'm not that good at recognising distinguishing Queensland Railways types. If I keep on having this problem, I'm going to have to go back to the you know, the raw version of the PowerPoint and just work from there.
Might be an idea, John. It's not making any move.
Yeah. We're not getting anywhere at the moment. Let's go here. Sorry. Even this might be a bit slow, but we'll see. All right, okay. The Beachside Tramway was in southeast Queensland and was a developmental line with logging and agricultural produce. The Belmont Tramway in Brisbane imported a Baldwin steam tram, which probably never ran on this line and was later sold to a sugar mill. The Aramac Tramway in Western Queensland ran through about 100 kilometres of rather, what I think of the right word, but wasn't a very productive area, and it was on very light materials. Lasted until the 1970s under local government control. They ran a infrequent passenger service using rail motors.
You could change to presentation mode, the button on the bottom right next to the slider, which would move it to full screen.
We'll see. How's that?
No, yes. That
I think we've just gone back to where we were before, sorry.
That's where we were before, yeah.
Yeah. Apologies, I don't think there's much I can do. And if I start fiddling around at people's advice, I'll probably end up being in a mess, so I'm sorry.
You had it on slideshow, which auto increments it. This puts it just in the big screen, that's all. So,
well, I just did that, but I went back to the slide where I was at before, so I'll give it a go, but I don't think it's going to work. No. All right, the Geraldton Tramway 2-foot gauge line near Innisfail, which later became owned by the government. Now it's just going mad, so sorry. Firstly, it was used for developmental purposes, and as you can see, there's a lot of Chinese banana growers in the area who used it for transport. A lot of bananas were exported to southern ports from North Queensland. This is the esplanade in Innisfail, and the sawmill is there showing how a lot of timber was brought in on this line. Passenger accommodation was provided. We now go a little bit further north to the Douglasshire Tramway, which connected Port Douglas to the town of Mossman. They were another 2-foot gauge line. This locomotive you can see there was the German Malay, and apart from their passenger and goods service, they also conveyed a lot of sugarcane to the sugar mill. They also had their own 2-foot gauge rail motor, which they had built for them. Mapleton Tramway was inland of the Gold Coast, and again, it had started off associated with the sugar mill, but was then owned by and developed by local government, and it was used for logging purposes and also for agricultural produce. Again, they had a couple of shades. It was a very steeply inclined line. It was closed down in 1944. A little bit further away from the, down the coast, also owned by the same local government authority, was the Buttering Tramway. This was 2-foot-6 gauge, and by the time they got round to actually building it and opening it, it was already 1914, and subsequently didn't last very long because of the competition from road transport. They had a German Kraus 062 locomotive, you can see here, and also they had a Shay. Logging and sawmill lines conveyed logs from the forest to the mill, to the to the sawmill, and or mill timber from the mill to the port or government railway. Some early lines had wooden rails, but these rarely proved suitable for locomotive use. The first to use locomotives was Pettigrew's Kalula Tramway, but other major lines featured a variety of gauges. Shay and Climax, as well as steam road vehicle conversions featured. So the first of these with a locomotive was the Kalula Tramway, the north part of the Sunshine Coast. And this locally built vertical boilered locomotive was used. A replica of it has been built in recent times and runs in a tourist railway or heritage railway at Maryborough. In a similar area was another sawmill with another locally built locomotive. It obviously had a long wheelbase, and I'm not sure how practical it was, but it seemed to survive quite a while. One of the best known timber tramways in southeast Queensland was Lay's Canungra Tramway, which was a 3-foot-6 gauge line, which had one climax, a number of Shay locomotives. And the Society has a booklet featuring this line. Munro's Tramway also had Shay locomotives. This was near Toowoomba and was 2-foot-6 gauge. You can see here mill timber being taken on the tramway to the Queensland Railway station where it was shipped away. On Fraser Island, there were a number of logging railways of 3-foot-6 gauge. They moved around a little bit. One was owned by Hines, a timber miller from Maryborough, and as you can see here, they used an ex-Queensland Government Railways tank locomotive as one of their engines. Mackenzie's used a very unusual locomotive from Scotland, a very rare builder whose name just escapes me at the moment. It'll come back in a minute. Some of the timber tramways in southeast Queensland didn't last very long, but used converted steam road vehicles. This is one of them that was later used on the Desert Tramway. An extensive 2-foot gauge logging tramway was built in the hinterland of the Gold Coast from Mudgery to Naranwood. It didn't last very long. It seemed to be quite speculative, and the locomotives later went to sugar mills. Carriage of vast amounts of firewood was common on sugarcane railways, mining and council tramways, but the line at Charters Towers was purpose-built to convey firewood to the pumping station on the Burdekin River, which supplied water for mining and domestic purposes. It was 2-foot-8.5 gauge using an orange diamond copper, as you can see here. Sugarcane railways, the 2-foot gauge lines of which we are familiar, they began to develop from the 1880s. The choice of gauge might be described as a historical accident. 42 Queensland sugar mills extending from the Gold Coast to Cape York had 2-foot gauge locomotive powered tramways, and there were quite a number of farmers who operated internal combustion locomotives on light feeder lines, of which more probably remain to be discovered. There were also some examples of cane railways of wider than 2-foot gauge. So the very first one was near Caboolture it was known as the Morayfield Plantation, and it used 3-foot gauge with wooden rails and a Aveling and Porter traction engine locomotive. Unfortunately, I don't have a photograph of it, and it may have been used largely for stationary use, but it was the first locomotive for sugarcane use in Queensland. The river estate was in Mackay, and extraordinarily, although it was 3-foot 6 gauge, built in 1879, they ordered one of Fowler's locomotives, which were really designed for 1-foot 10 and 2-foot gauge. It looks a bit strange there on 3-foot 6, and it didn't last very long, although it ended up in Victoria on a logging tramway. The most northerly sugar mill was at the Bloomfield River, which is way up in Cape York, and lasted only 10 years. But they had Fowler equipment, as you can see here. There's a wide variety of mills that developed in different ways, and for many of them, animal power was used initially, or even always. But this Cattle Creek mill, for example, eventually ventured into locomotive power. Victor Mill was on the Colonial River near Bundaberg, and this photograph reminds us that all sugarcane railways were not adhesion railways. There were examples of haulage lines, and also here, as you can see, with that particular incline going down to the river, there were quite a number of sugar mills that actually did use punting as transport for cane in the early days, as was the case here. The Nerang sugar mill was on the Gold Coast, and it didn't last much beyond the First World War. But again, it was typical of the small operations that were common around the time of the late 19th century. Another feature of sugar mills was that they often got deliveries of cane on the 3-foot 6 gauge government railway, where sugarcane is being transferred from horse trans at a derrick onto Queensland government railways wagons, and it'll be taken to the sugar mill by that means. In fact, this particular example, although I say it was government railway wagons, which it was actually a local government tramway, which was worked by the Queensland government railways. The Pioneer Sugar Mill, south of Townsville, was unique in being built entirely as a 3-foot 6 gauge tramway, which survives to the present day. And the reasons for this are a little bit obscure. 3-foot 6 gauge was a government railway gauge, but there was no government railway within a very long distance of this particular mill at that time. The mill was an example of quite a number of mills that were built with government funding. Basically, the farmers mortgaged their land in exchange for a government loan. Some of these mills really struggled, where others were quite successful, but a number of them still survive to today, although, of course, the government stepped away many years ago. Mossman Mill in far north Queensland was another example of a government mill, and you can see there a typical scene with the long lines of loaded sugarcane trucks waiting to be unloaded at the carrier, which is underneath that lower building, and then the cane would be conveyed along up into the main mill building where the crushing equipment was, and then the sugar juice was refined into raw sugar, what we might think of as being brown sugar today. The Colonial Sugar Refining Company was a very large Australian-based company with sugar mills in New South Wales, Queensland and Fiji, and they put a lot of capital into their Queensland mills. This one was in southern Queensland near Childers. They were a big user of Fowler steam locomotives on their 2-foot gauge, and later went to the Hudswell Clark 060 tender engines, which are well known. As I mentioned earlier on, the use of internal combustion locomotives was introduced quite early, and this particular example was at a mill south of Mackay. These particular oil engine locomotives were actually used by a haulage contractor who used them both to haul cane, as we can see here, but also used them to power a conveyor at the port where the bagged sugar was loaded into small steamships. Queensland Mill was in Bundaberg, and this photograph shows a pioneering Australian-built Caldwell Vale locomotive built in Sydney to a very advanced design. This particular cane railway had never had locomotives until this machine was introduced. Unfortunately, the Caldwell Vale company was tremendously advanced technologically, financially, got into very serious trouble and failed. The use of internal combustion locomotives in the First World War led to a revolution in narrow gauge railways, and we can see here a pair of simplex locomotives crossing the Barron River near Cairns. These 20 horsepower locomotives were built to a 4-ton design, a little bit heavier than the 2.5 tons that the Army had used. And they were very successful for use on light lines and for shunting in the mill yards. A lot of these machines also, though, were locally made using automobile parts or conversions. And you can see there a Chevrolet conversion at Marion Mill just outside Mackay. Back to a passenger carrying cane railway now. The Morton sugar mill on the Sunshine Coast saw an advantage in being able to convey tourists to beach resorts. And in fact, they had this locomotive built specially and had a variety of passenger rolling stock, which they ran in the summertime to supplement the revenues that came from sugarcane. We're back to the Colonial Sugar Refining Company here, and this very long bridge across the Herbert River, north of Townsville, is interesting because although it later became a locomotive work bridge, this photograph shows it when it was had incline haulage on either end. You don't want to go wandering around there because there's plenty of crocodiles living in that river. South Johnson Mill, connected to the government 2-foot gauge Innisfail Tramway, which is what the Geraldton Shire Tramway had become. And it ran passenger trains in conjunction with the government railway. It was a government-funded mill, so this came pretty easily. And it was one of a number of mills that were developed straight after the First World War, partly to open up new areas of country, but also to assist in the settlement of ex-soldiers from the war. A hidden part of cane railways, which we know relatively little about, is the fact that because they were there and because they served remote areas, the farmers were very quick to take advantage and to provide their own personal transport for themselves and their families. Although we've got a few photos of these and a couple of examples of them survive, there must have been very, very many more. And the mills had to try to control their use for obvious reasons. It was common that light lines or portable line was laid into the harvest areas in the fields, and the cane trucks were loaded by hand, and the trucks were hauled out by horses to the main line. As time went on, of course, with the development of tractors, they took over from the horses, and this just shows the kind of thing that happened. A short rake of loaded cane trucks being hauled out of the paddock by a Caterpillar tractor. This photo is taken from the top of a mill chimney, and you can see down below a line of 2-foot gauge steam locomotives closer to the shadow of the chimney, and then adjacent to the mill lagoon there, a 3-foot 6-gauge locomotive that was also owned by the mill and connected the mill to the government railway near Childers in southern Queensland. Another interesting event during the Second World War, there were a lot of American soldiers and sailors at large in Queensland, and this appears to be an excursion organised by a sugar mill in Mackay for servicemen, and obviously there a lot of their local female friends. The Queensland population regarded the US servicemen with some disfavour and described them as overpaid, oversexed and over here. Use of ex-World War I equipment did penetrate to Queensland, and there were quite a large number of these Hunslet 460 tanks that were used by sugar mills. This is a 3-foot 6-gauge ex-Queensland Railways small Baldwin 280 locomotive that was used at Bingara Mill. They had a 3-foot 6-gauge line connecting their mill to the government railway. And here at Mount Bothwell Mill, you can see again 3-foot 6-gauge and 2-foot gauge side by side. The mill had cane railways of both gauges. Here's one of the early locally produced small diesel locomotives. They're actually Genvac design and intended mostly for underground coal mines, but this was the prototype, and it's being used to shunt a large load of bagged sugar, which was going to find its way down to the wharf near Ferrymead Mill. In more recent times, steam did last until the 1970s around Bundaberg, and here's an example of a locomotive shed at Milliquin Mill in that era. They used locally built locomotives by Perry and Bundaberg Fowler. The big change that took place in the 1960s was the introduction of cane harvesting machines, which chopped the cane into billets and therefore required a new method of transportation. The old hand loading of sugarcane trucks went out, and the billets of cane were loaded into sugarcane bins. That technology is still with us today, although the size of the bins has changed considerably. But that's a very early example of some of the first bins for chopped cane being hauled by Hudswell Clark 060. This was an interesting one because the particular sugarcane railway goes underneath a very low Queensland Government Railway bridge, and you can see here the demountable cab in its lowered position, which Phil Ricard has recently written about in Light Railways. Getting into more modern times, multiple unit of locomotives was adopted in a number of mills, as you can see here with a couple of Comeng 060 diesel hydraulics. And more recently too, on the top right-hand side, is the conversion of government railway 3-foot 6 and standard gauge locomotives for 2-foot gauge use. This particular slide shows us the transportation of molasses, bulk molasses, in tankers on the left-hand side, and bulk sugar, raw sugar, on the top right. And the transportation of raw sugar by 2-foot gauge railway does remain in just one area. Modern construction methods of railways has happened, as you can see here, and there is still new 2-foot gauge lines being built, even in the 21st century. That was a fairly major part of our industrial railway scene. Saltworks is a smaller one. Narrow gauge railways were used to convey crystallised salt from coastal evaporation ponds to processing plant, and from processing plant to the Queensland Railway siding. Examples using locomotives in Queensland were at Bowen and at Port Alma, south of Rockhampton. So again, you can see there the broad expanse of evaporation ponds and the mechanised harvesting of salt put into wagons and then taken to the processing plant for washing and stacking. This is a Bowen, similar type of operation. They used Ruston, Hornsby and simplex locomotives in the later days. Mechanised harvesting of the salt took place. There weren't too many examples of this in Australia, but Victoria had some pretty good ones as well. Meatworks. Railways were used at meatworks for internal and or exchange traffic and taking product to wharf. Locomotives were used at Lakes Creek in Rockhampton and at Gladstone. For obvious reason, we don't have many photographs taken inside meatworks. Here's Lakes Creek near Rockhampton. They latterly used a 3-foot 6-gauge Lister locomotive, quite an unusual beast. And here in Gladstone, there were a number of home-built internal combustion locomotives using a wagon chassis. You'll see here looks like loading carcasses onto a ship, presumably. I suppose they must be frozen, I'm not really sure. Power generation. Railways are used at power generation plants for exchange traffic with the Queensland Railways, especially incoming coal supplies. Examples include Bulimba A and B powerhouses on Brisbane's south side, the Brisbane Tramways powerhouse at Woolloongabba, and the Mount Isa Mines Mica Creek powerhouse. So this is the South East Queensland Electric Authority line serving Bulimba A and B. That's a Baldwin Westinghouse locomotive, trolley wire locomotive, hauling old-fashioned coal hoppers. And they later obtained a Goodman mining locomotive, which Goodman had modified for surface working. The Brisbane Tramways powerhouse at Woolloongabba connected into the 3-foot 6-gauge Queensland Railway system, and they used an adapted tram chassis for their locomotive. In more modern times, Mount Isa Mines at Mount Isa has a powerhouse, which nowadays is gas-powered, but in the days of coal firing, there was always a locomotive station there for shunting the coal wagons. Sewerage lines. Light railways were used within the luggage point sewerage processing work in Brisbane for the movement of materials and the maintenance of the outfall sewer. So there was a variety of small, locally built locomotives used here. Again, photographs are pretty hard to come by. Metal mining, surface and underground. Railways have been used for transporting ore underground or on the surface, for operating processing plants such as smelters and refineries, for dumping waste, and for transporting ore, fuel and materials to the mine site and product to the mainline railway or port. Some major Queensland sites included Mount Morgan, Charters Towers, Cloncurry, Chillago, Mount Isa, Mount Molloy, Stannery Hills, Irvine Bank and Weeper. There's a whole lot of minerals represented there. The Chillago Mining and Railway Company built and operated an extensive private system in the Cairns hinterland, which was later taken over by the government. The Stannery Hills and Irvine Bank tramways were interconnected 2-foot gauge lines also in the Cairns hinterland. This is a gold mining treatment plant in Charters Towers, which used a rather rare Roby locomotive. Mount Morgan had 1-foot 10-inch gauge and specialised in the use of these General Electric overhead wire locomotives. They had quite a large number of these. They also had a couple of examples of 1-foot 10-inch gauge steam locomotives. That one was the second one, which was built by Chapman and Furneaux in Gateshead. And they also had an interesting system of the Hunt American system, which used rolling stock with the flanges on the outside of the rail. not much is known about what that was used for at Mount Morgan, presumably some part of a processing plant. At Morgan, the old underground workings were opened out into an open cut, and they used 3-foot 6 gauge Hunslop locomotives to haul the spoil out of the open cut, as you can see there. Sligo Railway, as I said, it was an extensive line serving a number of different mining areas in North Queensland, built by private enterprise and later taken over by the government. And the Stanley Hills Tramway, as I mentioned, 2-foot gauge mining railway. That's a brush from Loughborough. They had 2 of those 060s. Very, very rugged country, extremely spectacular and well-engineered railway. This was a Avonside 062 tank locomotive with a very large locally produced tender. They have passenger services, of course, as well as the movement of ore. The Hampton and Curry copper mines had briefly had a 3-foot 6 gauge Shay locomotive. Quite why they got it is not exactly clear, but anyway, they did have it and they did use it, as you can see there. The William McGregor Tramway was again in that part of Western Queensland, not that far from Mount Isa and Cloncurry, and it was a 2-foot gauge line which connected to a 3-foot 6 gauge tramway, which in turn connected to the government railway. Mount Isa Mines was developed pretty much from about 1930 with a lot of American capital, and their initial underground use of electric locomotives was using English electric units, as you can see there. On the surface, they had some 3-foot 6 gauge lines and used a couple of Peckett locomotives, which still survive. Much later on the 3-foot 6 gauge underground, they had a large automated overhead wire system using electric locomotives initially produced by Greenwood and Batley in the UK, and then later on with locally Australian-built locomotives. Still operated today in Cape York, standard gauge railway transports bauxite at Weipa from the mine to the port, and as I say, still operates today. Coal mining, surface and underground. Railways have been used in coal mining and for transporting coal from underground to the surface and across country to washing or screening plants, for tipping colliery waste and for moving product to wharf or railway siding. The Ipswich coalfield saw a number of examples of surface tramways, but the most prevalent use of locomotives in Queensland was of small diesels used for coal haulage underground in the Ipswich area in association with colliery modernisation in the 1950s. There were similar operations in other parts of Queensland, and also a couple of modern high-capacity underground systems on the New South Wales model in the Bowen Basin. That's a very early one, built in 1878 in Brisbane. It was a form of rack railway, but very little is known about it. It took coal from the mine to the river wharf where it was transported. Much more common were these kind of operations where the coal came out of the drift and was transported by a locomotive or often by haulage to a loading facility onto the Queensland Railways. This is in the Ipswich area. This is in Ackland, which was on the Darling Downs. There was a nice little museum here, but unfortunately it's all been overtaken by a huge open cut coal mine. This was the type of locomotive introduced in modernisation in the 1950s. Largely they came from back in Austria, but there were also locally built examples built in Bundaberg. Quite a number of these were used, even on 3-foot 6 gauge, as you can see there, at the Dawson Valley Colliery and Baralaba, which was the source of coal for Mount Morgan mines. The coal stage there, the timber coal stage, is on the one hand classified as a heritage building, and on the other hand, it's falling down and the first bushfire that goes in there will completely destroy it. So that's what happens with heritage, unfortunately. The Caledonian Collieries near Ipswich had a surface 2-foot gauge line using locally built 2-foot gauge locomotives that were built in Ipswich. Fortunately, they both survived. And it was further away from Brisbane, but again, the same kind of idea with the haulage out of the drift up to a washing plant and loading plant for the QR. It was the Begown Collieries near Maryborough after closure, with some of the locomotives from underground stored on the surface and the loading gantry behind. So there were quite a few of these which lasted until the 1970s. This was on the Bowen Basin near Blackwater, large mines developed by BHP initially, and using the New South Wales collieries model. On the top right, you can see the dolly car, which was used to attach trains of supplies going down the drift. And on the bottom left is the locomotive shed showing a lineup of diesels that were used underground. Quarrying and gravel extraction. Rows were used for transporting material to a crushing or processing plant or to a wharf or mainline railway. Queensland examples included for road building, land reclamation and extraction for cement manufacture. So quarries with elaborate 2-foot gauge systems were built in a number of places, particularly to produce road metal. That's one example. Here's another, an adapted motorcycle being used for a locomotive. Here is a line that was used at a quarry far west of Brisbane, where limestone was mined to be shipped to be railed to Brisbane for cement manufacture. That appears to be a TACL Malcolm Moore locomotive. Guano. Light railways were used in the 19th century for guano extraction on offshore islands. The product was used as a fertiliser. J.T. Arundel and Company had a light 2-foot gauge steam locomotive that was used at a variety of Queensland locations to transport excavated material to the loading wharf. We don't have a photo of it, but it probably looked very much like that one there. And in fact, it ended up being the first locomotive being used for phosphate mining on Ocean Island. River and harbour works. Light railways were frequently used for river navigation, improvement works and for harbour construction in association with quarrying and transporting stone and other materials. Locomotive haul lines in Queensland were at Rockhampton, Mackay and Townsville. So here's in Mackay, 3-foot 6 gauge line standard gauge line used for training wall works in the river. The Pioneer River, they spent a very large amount of money over a very long time trying to make it navigable. They all failed. And so they eventually built a harbour, ocean harbour, using standard gauge and with a variety of locomotives. The one picture there actually came from the New South Wales coal industry. Now, what's happened? Here we go. Tunnelling. Significant use of narrow gauge railways in more recent times was in tunnelling. The railway was used for the underground transport of spoil, workers and materials in the construction of tunnels for water, sewerage and other services. There are probably a number of others in Queensland used in connection with dam construction projects. Examples include hydroelectric and sewerage schemes, the Gold Coast Desalination Plant, and an undersea liquid gas pipeline at Gladstone. There's probably quite a number of these that have escaped notice, but anyway, we do have some information about some of them. Just waiting for it to catch up. Here we go. The Gold Coast Desalination Plant was built in the last 15 years or so, and they hired in modern equipment from the USA. That's what happens nowadays for these big projects. It tends to be equipment is leased in from multinational companies. The Gladstone Narrows liquid petroleum gas project, as I said, was an undersea pipeline. So they built a tunnel first and then put a pipeline through it. And this used German equipment, which was again kind of like a sale and return scheme that the German company Schirmer uses. Other construction works. Before the advent of rubber-type construction vehicles, light rowers are used extensively for public works projects and other large construction jobs in Queensland. This included construction of the Gold Coast Highway in the 1920s, Somerset Dam in the 1930s, and much more recently, bridge construction. This is in Cairns. Maybe it should be down as quarrying, but it was used for road construction and reclamation by the local council. This was the construction railway that you might have read about recently, a 2-foot gauge electric line for constructing the main sewerage line in Brisbane in the 1920s or First World War period. This was used on the Gold Coast for building the Gold Coast to Southport Burleigh Road, using a locally built locomotive based on the Model T Ford. And if anybody can tell me what this is or where it is, I would be very happy to know. It's certainly taken in Queensland, and it appears to be possibly a beachside location, but that's about all we can say at this stage. Somerset Dam was built in the 1930s. Unfortunately, somebody thought it would be a good idea to put wasp stripes on the front of the locomotive in the photograph. They actually weren't there originally, but anyway, that's the only photo we've got. And here you can see the use of a light railway to construct a concrete bridge. On the left-hand side, there's a 3-foot 6-gauge simplex pushing a girder out to a point where it can be winched onto the bridge piers. That was in Mackay, but that method was used apparently on quite a number of bridge construction projects built by Hornibrook Construction. Private sidings and internal traffic. Other industries use railways for exchange traffic and internal use. Examples in Queensland include Ipswich Joinery Works, the Evans Deakin Factory, Palmer Tube Mills, the Mackay Massey Ferguson Works in Brisbane, and the United States Air Force in Brisbane in World War II. There's also the rail-served sugar storage and export terminals on the Queensland coast, one of which continues with a 2-foot gauge rail connection nearby sugar mills. This is Evans Deakin in the Brisbane suburbs. They had a large plant that they took over from wartime construction, and they used these Perry contractor locomotives there in the early period around 1950. This is Arthur Foot's Joinery Works in Ipswich, using, as you can see there, internal combustion lorry put onto a wagon chassis. US Army in Brisbane. This is a stage photo. I very much doubt whether that crate could possibly be put into that trailer, let alone carried in it. But it just shows that even in Queensland, the Americans had fun playing around with Jeeps, and in that particular case, converting one for railway use. The Palmer Tube Mills at Acacia Ridge did, or maybe still use, this locomotive for shunting standard gauge wagons. You can see there it's a dual gauge track. They actually also had a 3-foot 6-gauge locomotive, which was used before this one. This one came up from, I think, Lysarts in New South Wales. It's a GE design built in Australia. The sugar terminals. So they used to have the 3-foot 6-gauge government railway brought in raw sugar in wagons, and then they had their own shunting units at the terminals. That's the Mackay, that's Townsville. As you can see, quite an extensive operation. Very, very large sheds full of raw sugar. This is the 2-foot gauge one, which still operates in North Queensland, and they have their own shunting locomotive. Miscellaneous, well, a unique locomotive operated example was the Maria Creek Tramway in far north Queensland, which was used for the transport of both logs and bananas in the early 20th century. But there were other similar lines that used animal haulage nearby Cowley and also near Cairns. So as you can see, they're quite a large bridge, and that's showing bananas at the wharf being loaded into a small steamship, and the bananas were shipped south to markets in Brisbane, Sydney and Melbourne. Just very briefly now, I finish off by just showing a few examples of other types of railways. The first one, tourist resort and amusement railways. Miniature amusement railways are well known, but Jim Longworth has helped us to bring to our attention a range of narrow gauge tourist and amusement railways, which are now nearly all defunct because of government regulation. These use recycled industrial equipment as well as home-built and purpose-built material. The most famous example in Queensland is, of course, the Big Pineapple on the Sunshine Coast, together with Dreamworld and SeaWorld. So one example of this was island railways. The very first one was Hayman Island, top left, and that was followed by Brampton Island. These are both in the Mackay area, Mackay region, and neither of them exist anymore. Bottom left, using sugarcane equipment, the island of St Helena in Morton Bay, just off Brisbane, that operated for a few years in connection with a heritage site on the island, but it's been removed. It wasn't really appropriate. On the right-hand side, bottom, is Quoin Island, which is a privately owned island in Gladstone Harbour, which is basically it's like a private resort, and that's a converted battery locomotive converted to diesel. Very well known is the some of the attractions in Queensland. Top left, Pleasure Island on the Gold Coast. That train there would be familiar to some because it ended up at Caribbean Gardens at Scoresby, and apparently that has since closed and the train's been sold. Top right-hand side is a pretty atrocious example of what you can do to a Ruston and Hornsby locomotive. Again, it only operated for a short time. Bottom left, of course, needs no introduction, the Big Pineapple, using 2-foot gauge Ruston and Hornsby locomotives. The bottom right one is a really interesting one because it was home built, and it's actually a diesel electric multiple unit. So there were electric motors in the wheel sets of all those vehicles. And it was quite an impressive job that the guy had done with it. Again, it's defunct now, but it was very interesting. And it was a tourist attraction that never really quite got off the ground. Also, we have, I suppose you'd call them attractions, where you have beachside railways. The top two are both examples of that. And Mount Isa Rotary was something they used to operate every year for their rodeos as a fundraiser. And in Blackwater, they used mining equipment, including a Gemback type locomotive. I doubt whether it still operates, but it was still there only a few years ago. And then very famously, theme parks. The top left is SeaWorld. That's gone completely. It was a diesel 2-foot gauge version of the Queensland Railways A10 locomotive. And the other three photos show a Dreamworld, which operated with steam for many, many years, displaced by the Italian-built diesel, bottom right. At the moment, the railway is closed, and I'm not exactly sure what's going to happen, although they say they're going to reinstate it. Railway contractors. 19th century railway contractors used their own locomotives and equipment from the earliest days of railways in Queensland. In more recent times, contractors have been engaged in railway demolition and rehabilitation, as well as construction. The most recent example is the contractor who built the Adani Railway in central Queensland using locomotives imported from New Zealand. So back in the steam days, as you can see there, different contractors had their own locomotives. The top right-hand one was very, very early in the days of Queensland Railways, and it was the same type as some of the early Queensland Railways locomotives. After it was finished with on the construction, it was sold to the railways. And the same with the Kitson 280 on the top left. Again, it was bought by the contractor, but when they finished their work, they sold it to Queensland Railways. Bottom left, a very well-travelled Fowler locomotive. You might recognise it because it was the one that was bought for running an abortive road metal tramway in New South Wales at Kiama. Never used there, sold off for contractor use in Queensland, and then later went to Tasmania, and it's in the collection of the Don Valley Railway. The big photo shows, I think, on the Stony Creek Bridge on the Kuranda Range, a Baldwin locomotive, which was used by a number of contractors in Queensland and ended up on the Cairns Shire Tramway. In more modern times, Medalia and Ben, a Western Australian company, used a small diesel for demolition of various branch lines in southern Queensland. The locomotive actually started life on Rottnest Island in Western Australia. Top right, Horny Brooks had a major contract in the 1960s to rehabilitate the Mount Isa line and had their own locomotive for that. Citra, a French company, used that locomotive there for electrification work in the 1980s in the Bowen Basin. There was a smell of corruption about that and brown paper bags involving Russ Hims and Joe Bielke. The locomotive originally been imported for tunnelling and dam work by Citra. And on the right-hand side there, you can see 2021, the company Martinez Rail built the coal railway for Adani, which again, most people will have heard about. Those locomotives were imported from New Zealand Railways. And lastly, we come to rail ambulances. A feature of Queensland was the use of rail ambulances on the government railway as well as on some private lines to serve the medical needs of far-flung communities. Some remained available for service up to the 1970s and even beyond. Other comparable uses of private self-propelled rolling stock on government lines included a rail motor used for cream traffic, private one, and line cars that were used by the Postmaster General telephone line maintenance staff in North Queensland. The last mentioned is a topic well worthy of further research, and I know it featured in Tasmania and possibly in other states also. But there's some examples of rail ambulances. Top left, purpose-built at Ipswich Railway Workshops. Top right, a charming photo of the Innisfail Ambulance Centre with their road vehicles, and also in the doorway there on the left-hand side, a 2-foot gauge rail ambulance that could be taken out, pushed across the road and onto the Innisfail Tramway. Bottom left, Charlotte's Towers, a local garage owner built that using, as you can see there, motorbike components. And bottom right, another professional railways, Queensland Railways job built in the 1950s for Cloncurry. And there's a wide variety of these, many more than in these photographs. So the presentation reflects a work in progress, as I said, to research and write a handbook of Queensland private and industrial railways. I'm looking for more photographs and information about private and industrial railways in Queensland. A significant area of information yet to be discovered, I think, is about non-miniature amusement railways used at drive-in theatres, beach locations and public events. And I'm also looking for someone who might be able to help with preparing maps and someone who can assist me by demanding prompt completion of the project, which otherwise is translated as standing behind me with a whip. So look, we got to the end. I do apologise that the PowerPoint didn't function as it was supposed to. That was partly because this was a last-minute job, unfortunately. But I will try to get it so that if I ever do another presentation, it will work a little bit more smoothly. But thank you very much. And over back to you, Bill. And if there's any questions or comments, or if there's any time for any of that, well, obviously, that would be welcomed. Thank you.
Well,
Excellent.
John.
Thank you very much indeed. Very interesting. Very, very interesting.
Yeah. No, thank you very much, John. That was excellent presentation. That yeah, technical difficulties aside, there's a lot of it's amazing the range of stuff that there is around like that when you start searching for it. But, has anybody got any questions?
No, just to say thank